Okay, so today we're talking about this. This is the Beyerdynamic DT270 Pro, and it's a smaller, somewhat unassuming, more affordable closed-back headphone that comes in at $150. And it's one of Beyerdynamic's better sounding headphones, believe it or not. And in this video, I'll have some things to say about it. So let's get going with the review. Alrighty, so the DT270 Pro, this, by the way, we just bought this unit. That's where it's from. The DT270 Pro, when I first took this out of the box, I couldn't help but notice how small it is. And that is either a strength or a weakness, depending on who you are. If you're looking for an over-ear headphone and you have large ears, that's the first thing to keep in mind with this headphone. But apart from that, the rest of it is fairly unassuming and fairly normal in a mostly good way. The build quality is reasonable and better than some of the competitors that exist for this headphone. But the whole thing is just this super bare bones, minimalistic, nothing fancy. And I actually do like nothing fancy. If you know me, you know that I like nothing fancy. And it also has full cup swivel here. And that's something that even some of their higher end headphones didn't have. So I appreciate some of the ergonomic design. I just wish that the cups were larger or that the pad opening was larger to fit my larger than average ears, because when I put it on my head, it kind of crushes my earlobes down here. So if you don't have earlobes or if you have smaller ears, this is going to be pretty comfortable, I think. But if you're like me and you have larger ears and you have these sort of flappy little bits down here, just that's going to be a little bit annoying because it's going to crush that into the side of your face. I don't prefer that. And the pad opening for this is roughly 50 millimeters across, and it's a circle, not an oval shape, and ears are not round. So, you know, I think inevitably this is going to be, you know, pushing up against your ear in some capacity. Which, again, I don't love that about this headphone. So, semi-on-ear, let's just go with that. The other thing to consider is that the cable here is one that has this sort of coiled design, and then it also has single entry on either side. And that is rather convenient if you need the cable to go a certain direction for your use application, right? It's flexible to be able to help you with that. Now, let's talk about the sound quality here. So I'm going to give you guys my subjective take here, how it just sounds to me, and then we'll go into all the measurements in the world to do with this headphone. But first I want to give you guys a bit of context and kind of set the stage for why this is interesting. There are a lot of folks who are interested in closed-back headphones that are competent, because closed-back headphones are not that great typically. The reviews for this one that also show the measurements of it indicate that it's rather good, or at least it measures reasonably well. So I'll be going through the BNK 5128 data and my on-head data for this headphone, and we'll see that. But first, let me just give you guys an indication of how this sounds subjectively to me. So this headphone is rather V-shaped, it's got tons and tons of bass, and it also has lots of treble. It's not as fatiguing in the treble as some of Beyerdynamic's other headphones are, but just to give you a broad strokes perspective on how this sounds like you turned the vividness or the contrast slider up in the image. And so it's going to give you a more bombastic picture of the music rather than a more natural one, which is, you know, if you think about something like a Sennheiser HD550, this is kind of like the opposite of that, right? That's going to give you the more natural presentation. This one's going to give you the more vivid, more bombastic, more intense picture. And sometimes this can work and sometimes it doesn't. Where this does work, I feel, is electronic music, anything that would really benefit from an extra sense of bass and treble. And I also find it works reasonably well for certain types of heavy metal recordings, depending on the guitar tone. Where this doesn't work quite so well, I find, is for certain types of instrument tones that are dominant in the bass region, so like upright double bass, that can sound a little bit bloated on this. And then also certain types of vocal recordings. There's a forward character in the upper mids that can make them just on the edge of being a little bit too far forward or a bit too shouty there. And then there's just a little bit of sibilance and spice there in the treble, because the treble is also enhanced to balance out the ridiculous levels of bass that this has. Now, in saying that, I think people are used to Beyerdynamic headphones like having that kind of V-shaped sound or like having that sibilance, because a lot of them do. This one is not it's not like that. It's not that amount of treble. The bass is huge here, but the treble is not so spicy that it's, you know, outright unlistenable or fatiguing. It sounds a lot smoother than most of Beyerdynamic's headphones. And the V-shaped sound signature here overall is a lot more well integrated than any of their other closebacks. And if you're wondering about detail and soundstage and resolution and the speed and the technicalities, let me just direct you to this video right here. It's just right there. Just click it. Okay, let's get into the measurements here because this is the good stuff. This is the juicy stuff right here. So the first measurement that I'm showing you guys here is the HPTF variation that we have here done for this headphone on multiple different headphone test fixtures. And I just said a whole bunch of things that like 5 if you understand. So for those who are unaware, headphones behave differently on different heads. You probably don't have the same head and ears that I have. Probably. Let's just assume for now. And that means that the headphones are going to behave differently on your head compared to me, compared to the test fixture, compared to the other test fixtures that we use. So this is a useful data point to show at least some sort of range for this headphone's performance. And it is rather wide. And I think part of that could also just be down to the nature of this design. You'd like to see a more narrow or consistent response across different heads and ears, but it's a closed back headphone and this can happen. The reality is with certain types of headphones like these, for real human heads and ears, it's going to vary even more than what this shows. But you can see the general trend here of elevated bass, elevated treble, and then there's this forward character in the upper mids at around 2 kilohertz. The rest of this is actually rather normal and, dare I say, more normal than Beyerdynamic's other headphones. So thumbs up. Now, let's move on specifically to the Gross measurements. And again, I'm showing you guys this first because this is the style of measurement that you might be most familiar with when seeing some of these other measurements online from other sources, because these are the more commonly available measurement systems, and they show it like this. Here you can see mostly similar features going on, but importantly, that forward character in the upper mids just isn't there. Now let's move over to the B&K 5 and 2.8 data here. It's a little bit more variable there in the bass because it's harder to get a seal on a full head rather than a flat plate, but that's a story for another time. The feature here at around 2 kilohertz, the 2 to 2.5 kilohertz, that's what I want to focus on because the rest of the features are pretty similar across the systems. You don't see this on the Gross, where you do see this on the B&K 5 and 2.8. And when looking at this, you might describe this as more of like a W-shaped sound signature. On the whole, this is not unreasonable. It's just slightly colored in a couple of spots. So enhanced bass, not just the sub bass, but mid bass and upper bass as well. Enhanced upper mid range, and then enhanced treble. This is what I mean when I say the sound signature here is like turning up the vividness slider or turning up the contrast because you're enhancing or embellishing certain regions of the music. This is all part of the balancing act that occurs when there's one area of the sound that is just a lot. And in this case, we're talking about the bass. So there are other things that need to happen in order to make that sound balanced. So you would want to have a little bit more treble there as well. It's probably still a bit much for me, but it's not stupid. Now let's move over to the on-head data. And we've talked about this at length before, but one of the things we do on this channel is measure headphones using in-ear microphones on our own actual heads. And because we've gone to great lengths to get our head-related transfer functions, so how our anatomy is filtering the sound, we can effectively turn our heads into headphone measurement rigs. And we can compare them so we can see how we are actually hearing these products and how that might be similar or different from the industry standard equipment. Because again, we have individualized ears, not ears based on the geometry from a data set. Again, we don't need to get into that here. Broadly speaking, the same features exist. You have emphasized bass, you have emphasized treble, but importantly, this feature in the upper mid-range between 2 and 3 kilohertz also exists on my own head. So what does this sound like? Well, in isolation, this sounds like a little bit of a honkiness or a glariness to certain types of instrument tones or vocals, but because there's so much bass here, it's not that bad. And there are occasions where this actually does kind of work. It can enhance the sense of detail that you have with your music. It almost reminds me of certain IEM tunings of old, which is interesting. The treble peak, again, this is what I was talking about earlier, where things can sound a little bit imprecise or not quite right. The treble timbre is not as incisive, not as revealing as I would like, and that's because there's just some embellishments going on there in the treble that are coming through in areas where the brain doesn't expect them to be. But this is also balancing out the bass to ensure that there's enough crispness up top to keep you engaged, keep it exciting. Now I just want to show you guys how this changes when I introduce glasses, because I wear glasses, maybe you wear glasses, and remember the chassis design here with the cup design, it's rather small, and I was actually expecting there to be a pretty substantial difference when I introduced glasses, because that's going to create a leak and that's going to make it so that, the seal is imperfect, but seemingly it doesn't actually make that much of a difference when I put glasses on. You can see there are a couple spots where it's a bit different, but that could also just be placement differences as well. But overall, I'm kind of impressed that when wearing glasses, this doesn't really change the response all that much, at least on my head. Maybe it's because my head is just so gigantic that it's, compressing the pads around the glasses or pressing the glasses into my head. Maybe that's what's going on. And for you, if you've got a smaller, more angular, blocky head, yeah, then maybe it'll cause a leak. Or if you have glasses with really thick arms, then it could cause a leak. But seemingly for me, it's no problem. I was kind of hoping that, with glasses, I would get more bass leak, and so then the bass wouldn't be so unhinged, but you can't always get what you want. Either way, I want to go through some comparisons now with you guys and show you how this is relative to Beyerdynamic's other headphones, because as I've been saying throughout this, I feel that the DT270 Pro is just the better sounding one compared to even the ones that cost quite a bit more. So the first comparison I want to show you guys here is with the Beyerdynamic DT770. That's the original one from, ages and ages ago that everybody has heard at this point. A common characteristic of these headphones is that you would get this strong dip feature in the transition between the bass and the low mids. And this could make the mids sound a little bit on the lean side of things. They do have lots of bass, it's just the bass isn't that well integrated. And despite the fact that the DT270 Pro has tons of bass, I feel it is better integrated into the sound. And then also, yeah, the DT770 has way more treble, making it quite a bit more sibilant. Let's take a look now at the DT1770 Mark II. And this one has also tons of bass, also a dip feature in the low mids. When you look at on-head data for these headphones, like some of these really strong and embellished features in the bass become less, but they're still kind of there. And for this headphone, it's a similar kind of story where there's tons of bass and it's just not really that well integrated with the rest of the sound signature. And then the treble is similarly a bit rocky on both. Let's move over now to the DT700 Pro X. With the DT700 Pro X, this was kind of like an evolution on the DT770's V-shaped sound signature. And you'll note that it has a couple of those same dip features in the low mids and then also in the upper mids that kind of balance one another out. But with the DT270 Pro, neither of those features are present. So the DT270 Pro is just a more coherent integration of this kind of sound signature. So that's interesting. But now let's compare it against the AKG K371, which is, I feel, its strongest competition, because anybody who was looking around that price would be considering the K371, especially if you are in the pro market, if you're trying to buy something as a reference point, if you're doing editing or mixing work, that kind of stuff. So when we look at the K371, again, this is back on the B&K 5.28 measurement fixture, you can see what I was talking about earlier, where it's just much more sub-bass focused. So they both have tons of bass, but the bass is way more focused towards the sub-bass on the K371, making that the core focus of what you're hearing. Whereas with the DT270 Pro, you get more tone and richness throughout the bass. Again, I still feel it's too much bass, but as I said, it's still better than some of the other ones that they've done. As a pro audio device, I still feel the K371 is the better choice because it is a more fair characterization of the music that you are potentially working with, if that's what you're doing, or say if you're editing videos and you want to ensure that the voices sound correct and you're making adjustments to that, the K371 I feel is still going to be the better choice. But from just a pure enjoyment standpoint, I can also see the argument for the DT270 Pro. And let's move over to the FiiO FT1, the closeback, which is also another affordable closeback headphone that is a little bit more in the audiophile space. The DT270 Pro is more V-shaped than the FT1. The FT1 is more of just sort of like a general kind of warm tilt sound signature. There's a bit of darkness to the ear gain for the FT1, and that is actually something that I bump up personally with EQ. And personally, my preferences lean more towards the FT1. I feel that's a really challenging headphone to beat, again, for that more natural depiction of the music. But there are people out there who find the FT1 boring, and if you're that kind of person, the 270 Pro might be the right kind of sound signature because, again, it's going for that more bombastic, vivid, embellished kind of sound that does work for certain types of music. So that's where I'm going to leave it. The DT270 Pro is, in my opinion, Beyerdynamic's best sounding closeback headphone. It does have a number of colorations, but they're not done stupidly, and there are certain types of music where this does work. If I'm listening to something from Polyphia or Pliny or something from Gogo Penguin, this headphone works great. It's only when I start to get into the more vocal-oriented stuff, some of the cracks start to form with it. My only big complaint with this headphone is I wish the cups and the pad opening were bigger, like a lot bigger, because the long-term comfort and wearability of this headphone could be better. And that's basically all I have to say about the DT270 Pro. I do want to give you guys a rating and a ranking though for this headphone. Just before I do that, if you guys like what we do here and you want to support us, we have a membership program up here on YouTube where you can watch all of the member streams that we do. That's basically me testing headphones behind the scenes and chatting with you guys, letting you guys know my process for how I evaluate these headphones. It gives you a sense of how a review is going to go before you watch it on the channel. With the membership program, it goes directly to us, the reviewers here on this channel. But more importantly, it also allows us to purchase other items to review, like the DT270 Pro right here, that we wouldn't ordinarily get in to check out. So consider the membership program if you find it is valuable. It really helps us out. All right, so for my ranking of the DT270 Pro, I would take this sound signature, this foundationally, and then just sort of tone things down, give a little bit more restraint to the sound signature overall. It's just a little bit overboard with the vividness for me. But overall, this is actually the highest rating that I have for a Beyerdynamic headphone. I give this one a 5.5 out of 10 for the sound quality. And that's going to sound weird to anybody who's unfamiliar with our system, but in short, we don't use the compressed scale where everything gets at minimum a 7 out of 10. We'd like to use the whole range to give a sense of how these things actually perform. If you want to see the rest of our headphone rankings, that'll be linked in the description. You can find rankings there of hundreds of different headphones from myself and the others on our team. And with that, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and have yourself a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.